Unions cause disunion in the union. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Our title comes to us today from a third part of the American Values as found by a guy named Dennis Prager. Prager says, I can find American values on every American coin. He said there are three American values: liberty, in God we trust, and e pluribus unum. That's our subject today. Do unions cause union or disunion? And my point is going to be that they cause disunion. Essentially, they discriminate. They say that some people can have higher paying jobs and others cannot. Well, that's clearly discrimination. There's no question that that's what they do. Here's a guy named Gary North writing an article called The Christian View of Labor Unions. And he says, quote, labor unions raise wages in exactly the same way that a business monopoly raises prices, by artificially restricting the supply of a particular resource, end quote, because it's labor. Yeah, if you can restrict the supply, the price goes up. This causes, as the price goes up, less is demanded. This causes unemployment. And it also causes inflation because, as I just said, the price of labor goes up. That's half of the definition of inflation. Inflation is increasing prices and wages. So think about it. There's very few things in life that really cause the two evils of macroeconomics, which are unemployment and inflation. Today we found the second thing that does, that is labor unions. What is the first one? Minimum wage. I've talked about that in a few podcasts. So if you're looking for something to cause trouble, it's minimum wage and labor unions. They both cause the two evils of macroeconomics, unemployment and inflation. Back to Gary North in an article called A Christian View of Labor Unions. Quote, the economics of monopoly pricing is the foundation of all modern trade unions. The labor union achieves higher than market wages for its members by excluding non-members from access to the competition for the available jobs. See, there's 10 biblical commands of economics that I found with a co-author in an upcoming book called Biblical Economic Policy. I wrote it with Sergei Sedamatov. I'm going to address three of those today as they apply to unions. The first one is, people should be free. We believe if God gave us the freedom to accept or reject the invitation of Christ, then that freedom should spill over to other parts of our lives as much as possible. We do realize that we are fallen humans and we can't be totally free, but we should be as free as possible. Unions restrict freedom. They don't grant freedom. Okay? So people should be free. Currently, there's now 25 right-to-work states and 25 not right-to-work states. This is producing a fantastic experiment, and the results are very obvious. Art Laffer's latest book is about this, the competition between the states. And what he shows clearly is those states that have right to work have growing economies, and those who do not have right to work have shrinking economies. And people are moving, they're voting with their feet. They're moving from unionized states to non-union states because that's where the jobs are. Look, the right to assemble and to form unions, I have no problem with, and nobody should. People are free. They are free to join a union, but they should also be free to not join a union. And that's the problem with the non-right-to-work states. You're not free to not join. You are forced to join. And our society has changed. I mean, back at the Carnegie days around 1900, about 1890 to 1920, in that time period, labor was really taken advantage of. And some really terrible things happened. And there was need for worker protection in that industrial era. They got the protection, unions became powerful, but through that time period, the rights that were mostly defended by unions in the 1920s, let's say, have been mostly replaced by government laws. Occupational Safe and Healthy Act, Child Labor Act, minimum wages, all these kinds of protections have been formed by the government, and that essentially took away the job that unions did during the post-Carnegie era. So the unions are not necessary to protect employees anymore. All they do is collective bargaining, and Mr. North is right about saying that they discriminate based on who's in the group and who's out of the group. The other thing that has happened is, I've just happened to do some consulting in a steel mill here in the last few weeks. Safety is so important to them, and you know why? Not because it's forced upon them by the government. It's because they want to keep good workers. And safety is important to keep workers healthy and to keep good workers, because they know if they have an unsafe environment, The good people will leave, and they'll be left with bad workers. Look, this is the market at work. And enlightened companies have figured this out. I mean, Carnegie ran these steel mills 100 years ago. They were a very, very dangerous place to be. In the steel mill I've been in the last few months, safety is so important to these guys. Why? Not because the government forced them to, not because labor unions forced them to. It's the market. They want good workers, and they know to keep them, they have to behave in a safe manner. So the second thing we notice here is, first is that people should be free. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. So if you love your neighbor as yourself, you will want people to have relatively equal powers in the economy. Prager University has this great video on called Public Unions, Public Enemy. And they quote FDR as saying, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal guy, right? He was all for private sector unions, but he was totally against public sector unions. He had the strongest words to say against public unions. Matter of fact, here's what he said. All government employees should realize that the process of collective bargaining cannot be transplanted into the public service. End quote, FDR. He called it unthinkable and intolerable. Because the point is, and this is the point made very well in this PragerU video called Public Unions, Public Enemy, is that it's a vicious circle. And here's what the unions say. This comes straight off of their, it comes straight off the website of the American Federation of State and County and Municipal Employees, their union. This is what it says on their website. Quote, we elect our bosses, so we've got to elect politicians who support us and hold those politicians accountable. End quote. Meaning it's a vicious cycle. So they raise money in the union and give it to the people who get elected. Those who get elected then are accountable, according to their website, to give them raises. Where's the cop on the beat? There isn't one. See, in the Christian worldview, we understand the fallen nature. If the union members are fallen and the government officials they elect are fallen, where's the system that helps rise above the fallen nature? There isn't one. You have two people talking to each other with no, so to speak, cop on the beat. This is partially what's led to the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit and will eventually, it seems, lead to the bankruptcy perhaps of the entire state of Illinois because of the public unions. In my lifetime, unions have gone from representing 33% of the population to now 11% of the population. But about half of that 11% is in the public sector. These are public sector employees who raise money, give it to politicians so that politicians will give them money back. It's a vicious cycle. Who ends up paying for it? Those who work in the private sector. All right, so the second title I'm on now is Love Your Neighbor as Yourself. If you love your neighbor as you love yourself, you wouldn't want unions because you want people to have relatively equal power. Look, there's this balance between management and labor, the powers between management and labor. In the Carnegie era, 100 years ago, management had too much power. Now it's relatively equal in the United States, and we have a pretty good system. I can point to you countries I've visited that do not have an equal system. The economy in Italy is terrible, mostly because labor has too much power. It's almost impossible to fire. Take you to the country next door, France. Peugeot, the auto manufacturer, tried to close a plant in France. The government said you can only close the plant after you find jobs for every employee. Okay, so when you look at this initially, you think, well, that's great. They're defending the labor. Isn't that good? But if you make it harder to fire, companies won't hire. And that's why countries like Italy regularly have unemployment rates of 12 to 14 and 15%. In the United States, when it gets above 5, we think it's terrible. As I'm recording this today, in October of 2020, we've just gone through a recession because of the COVID pandemic. Unemployment is 7.9. We think that's terrible. In Italy, they'd be deliriously happy with 7.9. Why? Because they make it so hard to fire that nobody will hire. That's the other side of this, right? Here's from the book I teach at the university by Greg Mankiw. Quote, when a union raises the wage above the equilibrium level, it raises the quantity of labor supplied and reduces the quantity of labor demanded, resulting in unemployment. There you go. You could have filled in the blank. Workers who remain Workers who remain employed at the higher wage are better off, but those who were previously employed and who are now unemployed are worse off. Indeed, unions are often thought to cause conflict between different groups of workers, between the insiders who benefit from the high union wages and the outsiders who do not get the union jobs. He just described discrimination. It's exactly what unions do. They discriminate against those who are in and those who are out. Hey, let me go back to Gary North. He's got something interesting to say about this in his article, A Christian View of Labor Unions. Quote, obviously nobody inside the union could reap monopoly wages if everyone were in the union who wanted to compete. The union would then become superfluous. It is only because of the artificial barriers set up against other workers that the union members reap their monopoly gains, end quote. Gary North in A Christian View of Labor Unions. He's agreeing with Mankiw, the macroeconomics book that I use in the classroom. He's saying that it is this discrimination that creates the value for the union workers and unemploys the non-union workers. Look, I've said this a couple of times and I'll make it clear. There is a role for unions, and certainly people should be free to join or not join the unions. It's just that in our particular age, they're doing more harm than good. In the Carnegie era, they would have done more good than harm. So our third concept here comes from the book by Arnott and Saidamatov called Biblical Economic Policies. It says the third thing that we think the scripture tells us about the economy is that work is good. If work is good, then we want people to work as much as possible and not to be constrained from work. And this is what unions do. Back to Mankiw again. Quote, when firms selling similar products agree to set high prices, this agreement is called a conspiracy in restraint of trade, and the government prosecutes the firms by violating antitrust laws. By contrast, unions are exempt from these laws. See, end quote from Greg Mankiw in Macroeconomics. Really a good point, isn't it? So if all the soft drink manufacturers got together and fixed prices, they would be convicted of conspiracy, and that's a violation of antitrust. Labor does exactly the same thing. They get together and aggregate labor and constrain it and set prices, yet they have the National Labor Relations Board, which you pay for as a taxpayer, a government agency, that encourages this. Mankiw one more time. Quote, workers needed greater market power as they bargained with employees. Well, that was the Karl Marx idea. Marx's idea was that those who own the means of production would always control society, and therefore labor unions were necessary to overthrow them. 150 years ago, Marx may have been right. In the long run, he turned out to be wrong. Yeah. Mankiw one more time. Quote, the resulting allocation of labor is both inefficient and inequitable. Right? So what's the answer? Back to Gary North again. In A Christian View of Labor Unions, he says the answer is let the market decide. If you've listened to my other podcast, you know that we say in economics, the market is where everyone votes. Everyone should get to vote. In unions, they're not allowed to vote. They're forced to aggregate their voting power into one block. In the past, there was a place for unions. Currently, probably not. Certainly, people should be free to join, but in the Christian worldview, we think that unions violate 3 of our biblical commands of economics. People should be free. You should love your neighbor as yourself, and work is good. Unions cause disunion in the union because they discriminate. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.